Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Using AI-powered analytics for digital acceleration executive webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nastasia Arendse, and thank you to our event sponsors, iOCO and IBM, for making this conversation possible. We do encourage you to use the chat facility throughout this session. It's going to be very lively, lots to talk about. So if there's any comments or questions that you want to share, please use the chat facility, and we're going to try and get to those questions, as many of them that is as possible. Of course, we have an event hashtag, so if you are active on social media, the hashtags to use, you can use hashtag analytics edge for business or hashtag transformative analytics. The recording will be made available after the event. If there's any aspect of the discussion or presentation that you want to come back to, we will make that available for you a little bit later on. So the COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically fast-tracked digital transformation globally, of course, launching a wave of exponential transformation. And that's why we're having this conversation in association with iOCO and IBM. Because in this particular conversation, we're going to be talking about the factors that accelerate business, why data and analytics efforts fail, and how AI-powered analytics is enabling technology-driven business transformation. To have that conversation from IBM, we're going to hear from Anthony Marshall, who's the Senior Research Director at the IBM Institute for Business Value. We're also going to hear from Lisa Jeanne Fisher. She's the leader for Middle East Africa from the IBM Institute for Business Value as well. And they're going to be focusing on digital acceleration around the globe and in South Africa, trends and research, of course, coming through from the IBM Institute for Business Value. When they are done, we're going to get into an actual panel discussion where we're going to be looking at the challenges and opportunities in optimizing data for differentiation. And there we're going to be joined by both Anthony and Lisa Jeanne, but we also will have Varsha Ramesar, who's the Cluster Executive for Data and Analytics from iOCO. And she's rather going to be joined by Dave Albert, who is the Global Business Partner Segment Lead at IBM Data and AI Apps. So we're also going to be looking in that particular panel discussion on why many data projects fail, how South African businesses stack up in terms of analytics maturity, and we'll find out which AI capabilities are most beneficial for businesses. So again, this is where you want to keep those questions coming. If anything comes up, pops in between the time we have the presentation or during that panel discussion, please feel free to share those questions and we'll try to answer them a little bit later on. To kick us off, to talk about digital acceleration around the globe and in South Africa, touching on those trends and the research by the IBM Institute for Business Value, I'm going to welcome to the digital stage Anthony Marshall, the Senior Research Director at IBM Institute for Business Value, and he'll be joined by Lisa Jeanne Fisher, who's the leader for Middle East and Africa at the IBM Institute for Business Value. Anthony, thank you so much for joining us. The platform's yours.
Nastasia, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's great to be here. Dave and I woke up very early to be with you. We're really looking forward to our discussion. If we're a little bit delayed in our response, apologies. I'm trying to consume as much caffeine as we can. It's about 4:30. No, it's heading to 5 o'clock in the morning here, but it's really terrific to be here. Let's jump to the next slide. Let me just talk very briefly about the IBM Institute for Business Value. IBM Institute for Business Value is a global organization. It is the thought leadership organization of IBM. And so we do a lot of fact-based research. We do a lot of surveying, a lot of interviewing, a lot of engaging with clients and others, a lot of partnering with academics and other organizations in order to really track what's happening in the globe, particularly focusing on technology, what the impact of technologies are. And we, in addition to doing sort of large scale, deep research, we're also doing pulsing research to keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening in business. We do surveying of employees and also customers or consumers around the world. So I'm going to talk briefly about the trends and the implications of some of the things that have been happening. let's just take our minds back to the beginning of 2020. So it was really about incrementalism at the time. So the sort of things that we were focusing on, our clients were focusing on, was advancing incremental transformation. Platform business models was coming up really strongly in all the discussions that we were having. A lot of business leaders wanted to form their own platforms and make investments around that. It was about improving business agility and resilience, but there wasn't really a sense of urgency. And of course, as ever, closing the customer engagement gap. We know what happened. Massive decline in global GDP, lots and lots and lots of jobs lost, and of course, tragically, millions of lives. Typically, the IBV would produce about 1 or 2 pieces of thought leadership a week. At that point, we started producing 1 or 2 pieces of thought leadership a day. And so we pivoted very quickly. We started doing launched a new range of pulse research. And what we were trying to do is based on the sort of things that IBM was doing in order to navigate the immediate impact of the pandemic. We were trying to share some of that with our clients and others. And so we started producing a lot of very tactical thought leadership in addition to some of the more strategic content that we were producing. So we produced output on business continuity, hardening supply chains, remote working, of course, cybersecurity, which started really picking up dramatically. We'd already done quite a bit of work on mental health, and mental health peaked as a huge issue, as we know, around the world. Previously, in the US, for example, prior to the pandemic, about 2 to 3% of organizations were really making any significant investments in mental health. That went up to 70% or more during the first few months of the pandemic. Loneliness and aging, we'd been researching as well, and we continued doing that to make sure that we were tracking as well as providing recommendations about how to navigate those sorts of issues, particularly using technology to navigate these issues. What did we see immediately? Well, we saw almost immediately a dramatic decrease in the time that it took to implement various initiatives in organizations. So this is on the left-hand side here. I'm showing you the decrease in time that it took to execute particular projects. So remote working decreased by almost 20%. Real urgency was happening. Process automation. As we remember, a lot of organizations were really having difficulty scaling up and scaling down, whatever, in terms of operating even their call centers. The embrace of AI really started spiking in order to supplement existing resources. People finding it impossible to get to work, and so automation, remote working became critically important. I've already talked about cybersecurity, and there are others here. What we also saw, in addition to a contraction in the speed, was an increase in investments in these areas. And so we started seeing a pretty major increase in investment across all of those dimensions. The barriers or impediments to these sorts of initiatives started falling, no matter what they were. Decisions were being made much faster in organizations. Barriers to transformation or these initiatives were starting to fall pretty rapidly. Cultural, organizational, as people recognized the immediate need to act. We saw some really interesting things at a global level. So 60% of organizations accelerated investments in digital technologies due to the pandemic. We saw a big spike in the investments in technologies that promote transformation or interoperability. So hybrid cloud as a proportion of investment in IT around the world increased by 12%. Public cloud started declining in some areas of the world, but hybrid multi-cloud started really increasing because they are really the drivers of transformation, because they enable the different parts of the organization to communicate with each other, and also for the organization to engage with ecosystems, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. We saw a 5% increase in budgets for AI and machine learning, as I mentioned previously. And there's some South Africa data here. I'm going to hold off, as Lisa's going to be talking about the South Africa data specifically. We heard at the time a lot of pundits saying investment in IT and other things were about to fall. We heard a lot of people saying CapEx was about to decline dramatically. That was not what we saw. In fact, when other people were saying that, we said, no. CapEx is about to spike, and indeed it did. And this is one of the studies that we put out during that analysis. We saw some really interesting pivot points. One of those were about, as I mentioned, interconnectivity and agility. We saw some really rapid movements in organizations, extending into the ecosystems, whether by choice or by necessity. And you had many of the larger organizations sort of moving into spaces that they had not previously populated. We started seeing much better financial results in organizations that were able to act quickly. So agile organizations outperformed. They had 60% better revenue performance than their peers. And we saw, as I mentioned, a big increase in these technologies that drive interoperability. One of the very interesting things that we saw, and we've been doing quite a lot of really deep analysis. This study, the conclusions of this study that I'm putting up right now, based on a very large survey, more than 7,000 executives around the world, we saw the benefits of combining technology investment with all of the various elements of transformation. This is a bit complex to read, but let me just quickly brief you on it. So if you invest in cloud, so public cloud, the revenue impact, the incremental revenue growth impact is 8%. So your growth rate, sort of a percentage, your growth rate typically would increase by 8%. But when you combine that investment with other elements of transformation, you get this multiplicative or exponential impact. So if you combine investment with cloud, with enhanced data capabilities, investments there, with other technologies, with other operating enablers such as skills, process, security, and with all of the elements of transformation, including culture and open innovation, you get this multiplicative effect up to 13 times. And so that is a dramatic impact in the growth rate of revenue. So basically the incremental growth of revenue up to 13 times if you basically combine investments in technology with the full spectrum of transformation of an organization. The power of transformation was coming through very strongly. And 13 times was an average. It varied by industry. And electronics was up to 25 times. Retail was less, 7 times. Banking, financial markets, 20 times. Very significant data. We saw that organizations, as I mentioned, were moving and expanding and opening up to ecosystems. Open innovation has spiked dramatically. We're finalizing a new paper on that right now. And you can see the data here moving from across 2019, 2021, 2023, this dramatic increase in open innovation. And in terms of the other elements of openness, platform business models, business ecosystems, partnering within your industry, partnering outside your industry, dramatic increases, really increases that of a magnitude that we've never seen before in the past. So that's the global outlook. Let me turn over to Lisa right now, who's going to talk about the South Africa data.
Thank you, Anthony. Hi, everyone. So I think, Anthony's given you this great insight into the fact that, technology has never been more essential than today. Data is being created at an astonishing and ever-accelerating rate, and it can be a source of immense value to a business if used effectively. And in order to do this, as Anthony just described, companies need a combination of technologies that can process this data and then turn it into actionable information. Now, the management and application of data is a very, very strong theme in South Africa. South African CEOs are far more likely than our global outperformers from our 2021 C-suite study to see technology as having the greatest impact on data analysis in the next couple of years. 72% of South African CEOs told us that they believe cloud will most help them deliver the results they need. 65% believe it'll be AI, 34% advanced analytics. Now, 1 in 3 South African organizations say that they are actually ahead of their peers in creating, acquiring, and validating data for analytical use. Sharing data and data-derived insights broadly across their organizations is helping them achieve improvements in process efficiency, cost reduction, and ultimately in customer satisfaction. And they see the potential of data insights to help them create new products, new services, new customer interactions, and to reveal new sources of revenue. Now, of course, big data solutions, including AI, predictive analytics, and machine learning, are able to actually sort through these huge data sets and return commercially useful insights. And conventional techs are just simply not able to do this. 30% of South African organizations that we surveyed say they've achieved competitive advantage from identifying opportunities to monetize data. Going forward, South African CEOs are rethinking and rebuilding their entire business models around the potential of these digital technologies. And more than half of them see an increasingly important role for platforms. Now, these platforms are cloud-based, and they generate value by virtue of being interconnected, by sharing information across multiple parties. So the implication here is that companies need to integrate data across multiple cloud and on-prem environments. And then, of course, they need to be able to secure this data and to secure every interaction and every exchange of value, not only across their own organizations, but also across those with their suppliers, partners, and customers. So, 50% of SA companies believe that, most of the data they need to have in the cloud has already been migrated. 46% believe that the ability to integrate data across clouds is extremely important in most use cases. And 33% say the requirement for data security to be embedded throughout the cloud architecture is extremely important in most use cases. So AI is going to continue to play a vital role in the way South African companies do business. For around 60% of them, the most important value driver for AI is to grow revenue by shortening the speed to market or reducing product development life cycles. Another way to do this, of course, is to reduce the sales cycle, but that is selected by less South African companies. In the next few years, they're prioritizing agility and flexibility. South African companies are much more likely than global companies to see that pursuing siloed objectives is becoming obsolete. And since the time of its implementation, AI has delivered operational efficiencies as well as improved the speed and quality of customer service interactions for more than 50% of South African companies. But of course, enhancing customer satisfaction and improving customer retention is the number one value driver for AI in South Africa and all over the world. So from a supply chain and ops perspective, around half of South African CEOs believe that technology will have the greatest impact on supply chain management in the next few years. Almost 1 in 3 say they've gained a competitive advantage from updating their processes based on insights from AI. So, for example, streamlining workflows or testing software. And from a workforce perspective, one of the top 2 priorities of South African companies' digital business performance improvement initiatives is to support employee productivity and collaboration. And their initiatives are actually working. Almost 60% say that they have seen an improvement in employee productivity since implementing AI. But not surprisingly, over half of South African organizations, both South African organizations and global organizations, say that a lack of skilled resources and technical expertise is a barrier to them adopting AI. And last but not least, cybersecurity. It's essential. Around 40% of South African CEOs identify protecting against new cybersecurity risks as increasingly important in the next 2 to 3 years. And they are planning to strengthen data security and privacy in order to build customer experience and trust. And here is another very, very interesting finding. For half of the organizations applying AI in the information security function, it has had a transformative impact compared with 37% of companies globally. So where does that leave us? Hybrid cloud is foundational. New hybrid ways of working, they require modernization of applications and of systems. And then, of course, to yield its full potential, technology needs to be combined with cultural change, the right skill sets, and open innovation. So a little more about where to access more information and how to reach us. The IBV, you can, our website is on ibm.com/IBV. If you'd like to get a copy of a full catalog of our research, you can email us, and you can reach out. We're on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. So with that, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today, and I am going to hand back to Anastasia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. So we're going to have Anthony and Lisa, who just did their presentation, and they're going to be joined by the rest of the panelists, Varsha Ramasar, Cluster Executive for Data and Analytics at iOCO, and they are joined there by Dave Albert, Global Business Partner for Segment Leads at IBM Data and AI Apps. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And I do want to mention, if you have questions that you want to ask, please put them in the chat facility, and I will go through the questions a little bit later on and also incorporate some of them in this panel discussion. Anthony, let's start off with you here. I mean, when you look at the results from your survey from a global perspective, was there any part of it that surprised you to, in a good way? And perhaps the other side of it, were there parts of that data that came through that kind of surprised you from a downside perspective?
So yes, Nastasia. So we've been working sort of on these types of topics for years now. So before joining the IBV, I spent probably 10, 15 years doing consulting with banks and financial markets organizations around the world. The sort of change that we're seeing now, not just because of the pandemic was almost like a spark, and where the speed with which things are happening is just absolutely remarkable. Never seen anything like it before. Over the weekend, I was actually writing the introduction of a new study we're about to launch on open innovation. And one of the things I've been working with a team on innovation for 15 years with banks and other organizations. And we had a framework, and we basically in this framework had different types of archetypes, visionary leader or marketplace of ideas or innovation through rigor. And we had another archetype called innovation through deep collaboration. When we would go and talk to clients, and we saw hundreds of clients, not one ever selected the archetype of innovation through deep collaboration. It was all, I want to be like Google, and I want to be like Apple, and all this kind of stuff. Yet what we're seeing now is almost all organizations are gravitating towards that archetype, right? So we're seeing this complete U-turn in the approach that organizations are taking in terms of being open and engaging with ecosystems, which is profound. So that was incredibly surprising. What was incredibly disappointing is that while some organizations embrace the need for really focusing on mental health, many didn't. In the United States, we're experiencing a thing called the Great Resignation now, where a lot of people who have not been treated well are just leaving, and their positions. And so the speed with which that's happening is disappointing, not for the people that are leaving, but for the fact that there's no reason for them to stay, because many employers have not made people a priority despite rhetoric. And so that is very disappointing. I think this is forcing a change, and I think that's permeating around the world.
Yeah. Lisa, if we can have your camera on, that would be really great. I wanted to ask perhaps even the same question as well. When you look at those South Africa stats, I mean, I found it quite interesting. 30% of companies believe that they've achieved that competitive edge. When you look at that data coming through, were you positively surprised, or is there still a little bit of work to be done so that we can get to those kind of percentages where we can say in terms of digital transformation, South African companies are moving at speed?
So, to be honest with you, no, of course, I'll be honest, the data actually was surprising, but in a good way. South African companies are actually very, very much in line with, with global organizations, both in their adoption of technologies, as well as in how they're prioritizing things. Now, of course, it's regulatory constraints, the geographical environments in which we operate, right, will have a significant impact on how organizations are prioritizing their technologies. And then, of course, the applications that they're prioritizing. So, one thing that I was slightly disappointed to see was that South African organizations are not nearly as advanced in their application of AI for marketing and sales. You do get some companies, there are a handful that are doing that, but South African companies are not doing it as much as they could. So if you think of, for example, Vodacom, they personalize offers because they collect customer data. They ask them, to talk about their digital, the lifestyle that they associate with, and then they offer them bundles. Now, it would be great if more organizations would start doing that. But it was very lovely for me to see that South African companies are prioritizing data, prioritizing its management, analyzing it a lot and applying that. And as well, they are prioritizing security, which is really important. And I am so sorry, I've just got a message. My connection's low. My camera will come back as soon as it improves.
Okay, no problem. Varsha, I noticed that in part of, Lisa responding to companies prioritizing data and analytics, you were nodding your head. I'm assuming you're seeing the same thing as well.
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing the same thing. And I think the point around integration that everyone's been speaking about is so critical. We're all talking about AI analytics and we think data scientist. And we think it's the data scientist will come in, rescue everything because they'll monetize the data, find those AI gems. But data is a team sport. So you need the data engineers, you need the integration of data. And if we really think about accelerating monetization and value, it's about organizations working together and collaborating, which is why you see the banks and telcos working together to give you better offers. But more of that would actually be more beneficial all around.
All right. Dave, let's come to you. I mean, we talk a lot about data being key to managing any organization. What are you seeing today in terms of what organizations are doing to improve their data analytics?
So I think the important thing to understand is that being able to leverage tools that make understanding and visualizing all the data that's being consumed is important. So as we heard from Anthony and Lisa, companies are pivoting to make use of remote workforces, which means they need to handle their data more effectively and more securely. So in our case, in the business analytics space, ensuring that customers that are planning, budgeting, and leveraging business intelligence tools make it simple for their users to access and understand the data. So also, it means they need to have it in a more secure environment. And this is what's making companies more comfortable that they've made the right decision.
Right. So a lot of the times we've been talking about, AI and analytics being embedded. And I'm curious, I want to come back to you, Varsha, before I get some opinions from, Anthony and Lisa. I mean, based on the trends that you're seeing, why is it important to, I suppose, for companies to be data-driven, and how are businesses leveraging data at scale?
That's a great question. So to start off with, why is data beneficial? I think Lisa mentioned, it's all about customer loyalty, customer branding. And that means the more we understand about people, the better equipped we are to give them the right type of products, the right type of experience. And data is a big part of that. So understanding the data of an individual, creating the concept of a market of one, not just calling someone and offering them a standard product, but actually customizing what's required for them, that requires data. And you'll often hear the term about a single view of a client or a single view of a customer or product. It all comes back to creating, again, an integrated view of data. In terms of how people are leveraging this on the large scale, I think the last 10 years, if not longer, we've seen people go down the data lake concept. And the data lake ended up being a bit of a data swamp where everyone tried to consolidate data, right? Lacked governance, or we could get data into it, but we couldn't get data out, which means, great, we've consolidated, but the value was not felt. We then moved on to data reservoirs, which was, let's add a little bit more governance into the space. And the end result, the companies that are doing really well at this, they're looking at data ecosystems, meaning a place for a data lake, a place for a data reservoir, a place for my analytics competency to work, a place for my data warehouse type of reporting to work. So it's more about creating the fit for environment based on types of use cases that you're trying to create. And companies doing that are really excelling and are ahead of the curve.
Anthony, what are you seeing in terms of these companies that are excelling and being ahead of the curve? And I suppose the next part of that question is there a ladder, so to speak, when it comes to AI and achieving those outcomes that you want to achieve from an enterprise perspective?
It's a good question, Nastasia. So in terms of the organizations that are succeeding, it's those that can pivot really quickly. And so, I mean, we talked about, we talk about agility, and it's a bit of a cliche, but it's actually real. And so organizations that are able to pivot and react very quickly are the ones, our data is showing that they are the ones that are being much, much more successful. And a lot of organizations recognize, or business leaders in organizations recognize, we're navigating a pandemic right now, but who knows what's coming next? And so the contingency planning, and we're seeing buffers being installed in supply chains once they come up and running again. And so it's really resilience and agility that's key. In terms of AI, we've been tracking AI for a decade now, and we've seen a dramatic increase in the adoption of AI over the past 2 years. And again, whether it's AI or other emerging technologies, for example, quantum technologies, which are new, but organizations need to start not only looking at advanced applications of AI at this stage, but also need to start looking at other emerging technologies and actually put systems in place in order to understand, to identify and understand those technologies and what the impacts in business will be. If we are seeing an acceleration, then all of these things are going to accelerate at the top end, at the top organizations. And so it's important to be part of that narrative of acceleration and agility.
On that then, Lisa, is it fair to ask whether some industries are more sensitive to technology adoption than others?
Absolutely. And the answer to your question is yes. Technology adoption and how it's used varies significantly across industries. So, for example, when you're dealing with industrial sector companies, they're dealing with operational technology and they've got different constraints. Now, from an analytics and AI perspective, you would see, we actually, in a recent study that we just published, the healthcare, the number one technology for them is actually advanced analytics. But for automotive, I think it was Internet of Things. So, organizations have different requirements. They have different business models. And so, of course, the technologies that they're going to deploy will differ. So I'm going to go back to the example of automotive companies and suppliers, or, for example, electric utilities. The Internet of Things is immense. They all operate over immense geographies, right? So when you instrument, for example, the grid, and you collect data around how that is operating, right? The Internet of Things becomes critical. And then, of course, you want to analyze that data, and you could do it for predictive maintenance, for example, whereas a bank has got a completely different requirements. So the technologies that they will prioritize will be different.
Dave, I mean, sure, sorry to cut you off there, Lisa. I'm curious to know, I mean, how do you begin to answer the question, or rather, where should you start when you're trying to figure out whether your business is data ready or analytics ready?
So I think, you know, as we're hearing, there's more and more data being brought into every organization. People are managing their data differently. They're consuming more and more data all the time, and they're consuming it in different ways. So I think it's important to understand where the data is coming from, which eventually will help you decide how you analyze that data. Based on, you know, as Lisa's saying, different organizations are looking at things a little bit differently. They're leveraging different types of software. Being able to understand what's in the data, I think, is critical. You know, you mentioned an AI ladder. In the field that I focus on, which is business analytics, we sit at the top of that AI ladder, where there's the security, the governance, the data, the collaboration underneath. But how you look at that data and everything that's underneath it is what's important. And the key here is understanding, you know, the pivot that we're hearing to digital. Most companies are either taking advantage of that digital revolution and consuming their data in a more digital centric manner as opposed to on premise, or if they're not, they're in the process of figuring out how they're going to do that. So leveraging all the data that you have, but understanding how to analyze it is another, you know, is pretty much a completely separate topic. You need to know the data, but you can't understand the data without the analytics. So it's they, you know, as separate as they sound, they are, you know, very interrelated.
Yeah. I want to stay with you on this one. There is some questions that are coming through, and we're going to get to them in a little bit. And just for the audience, please keep those questions and comments coming. But let me stay with you, Dave, on this one then. On the you know, the topic of business analytics, I mean, what trends are you seeing in the market when it comes to business analytics solutions?
So the key trends that we're seeing, we see a lot of our customers have now begun to shift toward how they consume the software. So our software is pretty much data agnostic. We're not really focused on what the data is in the back end, but how the consumer looks at the data. So how they analyze their information, being that in reporting or in dashboarding, if, you know, if they're delivering regulatory reporting, or if they're you know, building dashboards to consume the data on a regular basis. It's how they consume the data, but also making sure that it's, you know, it's governed and it's secure. You know, one of the questions in the chat was, you know, focus that AI is simply a technology. Although it is a technology, the benefit of how we leverage AI is more of an, you know, as opposed to artificial intelligence, we term it as augmented intelligence. So allowing the software to understand a user's patterns. So making sure that a user is not always presented with new information, but rather presented with information based on their historical work patterns. You know, if I'm building a dashboard and I constantly use the same types of charts because I work in a specific industry, I'm going to be suggested similar types of charts, for example. So understanding where the data comes from is one thing. The fact that companies are shifting to, you know, to a more digital world, we're seeing them, you know, probably a 20% increase in the number of customers that are accessing their data digitally. So they're using a software as a service subscription model. So, and, you know, business partners like iOCO are enabling our customers to get there, but understanding the benefits of you know, getting to that type of business without interrupting the way they're doing business now.
All right, let's speak to iOCO about that. Let's discuss those business analytics solutions, those trends that you are seeing, Varsha.
I think especially with COVID, there's been a lot of focus on things like cash forecasting and cash management. So getting the basics right from a financial aspect. So always think about all the fancy stuff AI can do, but actually just getting the business predictions correct, understanding how to manage that cash has actually been one of the forefront things. And again, companies who are able to do that more effectively were able to be more agile in this space. So that's definitely been one of the trends.
Right. Anthony, here's a question that, always plays in my mind sometimes when I look at these stats around AI adoption by various companies. Do you find that some people are slightly, and I'm probably using the wrong term here, but slightly cynical about the benefits of AI, or are people starting to warm up to that idea that, AI and data can be beneficial to my company?
I actually coincidentally pulled some data yesterday for something different, but I can share it with you now. Right now, we're tracking that 78% of organizations globally have adopted AI in some form. Before the pandemic, that was in its 30s. I mean, this is when I talk about acceleration. We're seeing that 82% of organizations are adopting IoT at this point. 97% of organizations have adopted cloud at this point. And so these numbers are sort of like, using a sporting analogy, which I'm really bad at, but sort of knocking it out of the field, right? And so in terms of AI, it's less that organizations are cynical about its adoption. I think it's really that organizations are only beginning to understand the full impact and measure of AI and the benefits that it can bring. That being said, AI has a lot of inherent problems. We're about to bring out a study on AI ethics, right? And AI bias is really, really important topic to focus on. And so it is an incredibly powerful technology that we are only now starting to look at the full implications and benefits of AI. But there are key issues that we need to be very aware of as organizations navigate, because the downside risks, both for customers, for society, and the organizations that abuse AI are profound.
Yeah, Varsha, let's get your opinion, and we'll get Lisa's opinion as well afterwards. Do you gauge at this particular point where and how does ethics play into AI? Perhaps from a South African perspective, if you are a business that has a certain outcome that you want to achieve, how much of that ethics conversation is coming to the table from the conversations you're having with organizations?
Yeah, it is a bit slow to the table. And when we're faced with a question on ethics, I'm sitting with two perspectives. It's a common phrases you might have heard in the data world. One is you torture the data enough, it'll tell you what you want it to tell. And I think that's some of the cynicism, where you can make the data tell the story that you want. On the other side of that coin is the opinion of if you just come without data, all you have is an opinion. It's backed by nothing. So somewhere in the middle is probably where the truth is, especially in South Africa. And we have seen this in trends in the US as well, though. Models are created by human beings, which means they're built with biases already. And what happens is if that data set is not expanded sufficiently, the biases will continue to exist. So one of the things we do talk to clients about is, yes, you can start training or building a model around a certain data set, but to try and reduce the amount of bias within a model, you really have to expand it. So for example, when it comes to credit scoring, and you have someone who's living in a settlement, you're always going to score them low, unless you look at them more holistically, bring in more data factors, and you cater for that. So you've got to actually cater for the diversity that South Africa is, and that can only come again through access to data and creating more and more training models.
Lisa, what are you seeing from an ethics point of view? Is it slightly different, or is it also the same the way as Varsha has kind of described it? I think you're on mute, Lisa.
okay, that was unfortunate. Sorry. No, so I think Varsha pretty much summed it up. I think that bearing in mind, of course, that, AI adoption and widespread AI adoption in South Africa, it's nascent. AI in South Africa, to a large extent, is nascent in most areas. So, the ethics is exactly as Varsha described it, just in training models and in increasing the data sets. But, I think we're going to start seeing a lot more of it. I think from a perspective of, security, and I think also from a perspective of facial recognition technologies, that the issue of ethics is going to need to be given a lot of attention going forward.
Yeah. Dave, your thoughts in terms of what you're seeing on your side of the world?
I think, as I said, people are working a little bit differently. They're consuming data differently. There's more, I think, internal collaboration. We look at, the idea of extended planning and analytics. So different parts of an organization work a little bit differently, but they also need to collaborate a little bit differently as well. So being able to access all of the same data, being able to share the information and ultimately come up with a single version of the truth is important, regardless of where the data comes from. But it's ultimately a team project.
Yeah. Varsha, are you getting the questions, I suppose, from companies? We've been talking about digital transformation for probably the longest time now, and we've been hosting these events alongside with IT Web, talking about, where companies could be in their digital transformation journey. Do you get that question where, a company's sitting and thinking, do we need to be incurring all these costs when it comes from an infrastructure perspective? Or is it easy for me to be able to deploy data platforms and solutions? Are those questions coming up more often for you from your interactions?
Yes, they do, definitely. There's always a cost question and the ROI question, because again, data, do you get value from day one? Or after getting infrastructure in place, does it take a couple more months or sometimes a year before you actually see value? So that question is always on the table. And the approach that we usually discuss and the approach that is more successful is around being use case based. So not going in for large infrastructure investments. So even if you're going cloud, I think the analysis work showed that a lot of people are going hybrid cloud. So instead of just like pushing, yes, I have to go cloud to one single solution, or I have to have an on-prem solution, it's more around what is the use case that's going to add the most benefit to the business in the quickest time possible. And then from backwards engineering that, what is the right infrastructure to support that? And that might mean if it's a use case that's simple enough and agile enough, you might be able to actually spin up a cloud within a week, get your use case out there and show some value. That value then feeds back into the business case, which helps the business progress and justify the cost for something like this.
Right. Anthony, from the research you may have done in the past, the cost question, how do I approach it as a company, probably sitting as one of the participants here, thinking about taking our division to the next step?
So you cost in terms of the cost of the investment, also the benefits of cost in terms of reducing operating costs within an organization are of course critical. What we find, but costs are relatively easy to measure, right? What we find is, although much of the conversation is inevitably around cost, when we survey executives around the world about what benefits they are looking for top line growth, right? And top line growth is much more difficult to measure when you're investing in something like AI or indeed any other technology. And so there are a couple of ways of approaching that. One is very assumption driven in terms of developing models and trying to anticipate new products and changing in demand. The other is data driven, and that's the way that we adopt it. So the numbers that I was talking about in terms of incremental revenue impact, that's the sort of analysis that we're doing now. And so when we talk about cloud, when I talked about cloud and combining cloud investments with other elements of digital transformation and the incremental impact on revenue, however that's obtained, that is statistically, extremely, it's significant. So it's a very credible number. We could apply, haven't yet, but we will. We could apply that analysis to any technology, right, including AI, and so we'll be able to see the anticipation of likely benefits at the top line. How you get those benefits, how you arrive at those benefits, is going to be pretty unique for each circumstance, whether it's an industry, an individual organization, or indeed a country. It's going to vary, but we can be very confident that those benefits are there.
Right. Lisa, a little bit earlier on in Anthony's presentation, I mean, we were talking about, what's happened between pre-COVID and now when it comes to, companies' tech responses. And some of the responses that we've seen right now have been quite rapid, and chances are they will continue well after the pandemic. With that being said, I mean, what would you say are some of the challenges facing the CIO right now or CTO right now with all of this happening in the background, and you also trying to help the business in its digital transformation journey?
So that's a great question. And I think that there's really two things. So number one is security. And I have to say that this is, I cannot stress enough, digital transformation, bringing everything online, business interactions, personal interactions, it significantly increases the potential attack surface. And, not all organizations were, from a security perspective, were ready for this. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges for organizations, is to be able to not only secure their own resources and their own people, but also now the increasing business interactions, the supply chain risk. The more online you go, the more suppliers you allow onto your network, the more people, the more opportunity there is for breaches, right? So I think there's that. And then I see there's some very, very interesting questions coming up around skills. That's the other one. People that can actually bring the transformation to business, right? So implement the technologies, utilize the technologies to their maximum advantage. So I think it's security and skills.
Yeah. There is a question that has come in here. The big question, it reads here, the big question out there is, how secure is the cloud, especially where there has been actual companies being hacked? I don't know who wants to take that one. Dave, do you want to give that one a go?
Or I can.
Okay, let's, Dave, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, let me just give you a quick synopsis here. I think that's a very legitimate question, and I think, obviously one that a lot of companies consider when you're looking at moving to cloud. IBM has obviously made a huge investment in their hybrid cloud business. The fact that we're working with customer data that's could potentially cross borders. That's one solution. But I think the investment that we've made in making sure that there's encryption on both ends is important. So I think it's a very legitimate question, but obviously I don't have all the technical detail behind it, but the efforts put in by IBM and the investment in moving to that type of business in the future is important. The fact that we're working with customer data is extremely important. This collaboration, the security governance that Lisa and Anthony have been saying is critical to the thought process as we move forward. And it's the same with the planning and budgeting and business intelligence that we're doing. The encryption is a huge piece of that. And I think Lisa probably wanted to.
Yeah, Lisa, do you want to give that answer a go as well?
Sure. I think I have recently We have recently published a paper on zero trust security as well as cloud security, and we actually did a cloud security for South Africa paper that is available. So, what we found is across the world in 2020, 90% of cybersecurity incidents at companies originated in cloud-based environments. Now, that's a really, really frightening stat. But given the fact that cloud is foundational, you cannot really do business today without being on the cloud, right? And without and going forward, the ability to leverage platform business models and get the value out of that, right? There needs to be organizations need to be able to maintain a secure, a consistent security posture across cloud providers, as well as within their own digital state. So you asked the question about how secure is the cloud. The cloud is as secure as you make it. Organizations have to be very, very clear, have clear SLAs in place between them and their cloud providers, saying who's responsible for securing what, so that there's no gaps. And then they need to really, really focus on building this, this consistent security posture across cloud environments.
Right. Anthony, I want to throw this one at you while we've got the last few minutes of the webinar. How do we bring in the conversation around the skills gap within an organization? Because a lot of what we're speaking here is going to depend on the skills we're able to attract as an organization.
So we've been doing a lot of work on this over the years as well. And fortunately, IBM has been a leader in this in terms of defining new collar, what is referred to as new collar skills. And so right now that there's a battle for a very limited number of skills out there, right? Skills and experience. What is largely untapped is the talent that's around that doesn't necessarily have formal qualifications, that can be skilled up with robust training and education, and tapping into that entirely new group of talent and bringing that in. And so you can adopt a very narrow approach to this, which is fighting everyone else for a talent pool, and certainly in certain instances you need to triage and do that. But it's really important to adopt a more thoughtful strategy and go to places and spaces where it is far less contested. And the benefits to the organization of doing that are huge. The loyalty that community is likely to give you as an employee-employer relationship is massive. And the benefits to society are huge, as well as you're helping various communities gain the benefits of having a college education that they haven't had the opportunity of fulfilling in a formal setting.
Yeah. Barsha, there's a question that's come through here. We've got about a couple of minutes left. How do you create a data-driven culture throughout the organization?
That's an excellent question. I think one we struggle with quite a bit, and we talk to people quite a bit about. So the one aspect is data literacy. And data literacy is how do you get people who are not data people understanding data, making sense out of it. So one of the metrics to understand where an organization is in terms of maturity is to do something like a data literacy assessment, and then with an organization, help them build out what could good data literacy look like within that organization. It has to be cultural. It has to be embraced. It has to be embraced across all levels. So it's not just a top-down thing. It has to be everyone. If I'm a teller at a bank and I'm capturing information, I need to understand the impact of good data quality going into a system and how that actually impacts the business. So it's critical at all levels.
Dave, I'm going to put you on the spot here. In 30 seconds, what would you say people need to remember top of mind as they wrap up this session and try and think about ways to take their companies forward?
So I think, obviously the pattern is for companies moving more toward a digital world, leveraging hybrid and multi-cloud. But I think it's important when you're looking at how you make those investments there have been so many advancements in machine learning, natural language processing, and AI, leveraging tools that make it easy for your employees and your users to access that data is important. And this is where all of our focus goes, in the business analytics space. Building software that allows customers better self-service, so that it's not only data scientists that can access the data. It gives the average user the ability to use the software to their capabilities. It's important to have that collaboration, across an organization, but making it easy for the users to consume and analyze, predict and plan on their data.
Yeah. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation, and there's so many questions that we could have gone through another 30 minutes or so, just talking about what various companies are experiencing in terms of challenges and also the opportunities that they are seeing. And hopefully we'll reconvene again to have a more in-depth conversation. Thank you to Anthony Marshall, Senior Research Director at the IBM Institute for Business Value, joined there by Lisa Jan Fisher, Leader for Middle East and Africa, again at the IBM Institute for Business Value, Varsha Ramasar, who's the Cluster Executive for Data Analytics at iOCO, and also we had Dave Albert, Global Business Partner Segment Lead at IBM Data and AI Apps. Thank you so much, everyone, for waking up super early to be with us, and thank you to iOCO and IBM for making this conversation possible. Until next time, goodbye.
Thank you.